Chapter 20. The day of the first snowfall, Mercy got out of bed. Judith, venturing outside as far as the well, came back, her cheeks glowing with bits of feathery white clinging to her cloak and her dark curls. "'Tis snowing," she announced. "Snowing?" Mercy struggled up on one elbow, her voice eager. "Come, let me touch it, Judith." Judith drew near the bed and held out her sleeve. The decks of white vanished under Mercy's reverent fingertip. "I must see it," Mercy insisted, "just for a moment. Mother, I can't miss the first snowfall." It took much preparation, as though for a long journey. 2 pairs of knitted wool stockings between her feet and the cold boards, the blue shawl wrapped securely around her ears, and a heavy quilt swaddled around her from head to foot. They formed a little procession. Rachel and Judith supporting the invalid at each elbow, and Kit following behind to hold up the trailing ends of the quilt from the sanded floor. Very slowly, they crossed the room to the front window, and Mercy sank weakly into a chair and rested her chin against the window frame. Outside, the gray afternoon was speckled with drifting white. Already a thin powdery dusting had gathered in the wagon ruts of the road. The flakes fell softly, vanishing in the heaps of brown leaves, swirling in little smoky coils. "I love the first snowfall better than anything in the world," sighed Mercy, her eyes worshipful. "I can't imagine why," said Judith practically. "It means you can scarcely step foot out the door again till spring." "I know, but 'tis so beautiful, and it makes the house seem so warm and safe. To think that Kit has never seen snow before! Go to the door, Kit, and feel it for me." Kit went obediently to the door and stepped outside. The white flakes made a queer sort of confusion before her eyes. They brushed her cheeks like tiny flower petals and caught on her eyelashes. For a moment, her heart lifted with a trace of Mercy's excitement. Then the cold dampness soaked through her thin slippers and she shivered. "I'm not sure I like it," she thought. "It's curious and lovely in a way, but it makes everything so dark, and somehow it makes me feel shut off. Somewhere far beyond this endless curtain of white, green leaves and flowers were growing under a bright warm sun. Would she ever see them again? Next morning, her dark fears were swept away with a rush of wonder. Under a cloudless blue sky stretched a breathtaking, glittering universe carved of dazzling white coral, unreal and silent. Every familiar sign was altered. There was no trace of life or motion. It was though no eye but hers had ever looked out upon this purity and perfection. Then, as she looked, a living thing dared to intrude upon this untouched wilderness. Through the white carven carpet that had been High Street pushed 4 oxen buried up to their middles, dragging behind them a heavy plough. Now fell away from the great blade in a gigantic wave. "They are breaking out the road," explained Judith. Now we will be able to get to the lecture." That evening, for the first time since Kit's arrest, William came to call. He had stayed away, he explained, out of consideration for the illness in the house. He inquired courteously after Mercy's health, and she smiled at him from the bed where she sat propped against the feathered pillows. Rachel uttered to draw a chair for him. On the opposite side of the hearth, Kit was intent on her spinning. She had taken over Mercy's axe wheel and was slowly mastering the art of winding a fine uniform thread. It took concentration and a steady hand. Now the humming of the wheel barely slackened as she raised her eyes for one grave, cool look. William's eyes flickered away toward the leaping flames. It was Judith who kept the conversation going. She had fiercely resented her enforced absence from church and lectured. Now she demanded to know everything that had happened, which of her friends were up and about, and when they might be a sleighing party. I hope John gets back soon, she sighed. Thankfully, Peabody's wedding is to be in December, and I can't bear it if he isn't here for that. They say in the town that there's been no word from the detachment since they've stopped at Hadley. There's been new Indian raids up Deerfield way. Judith dropped her knitting and stared at William. Mercy leaned her head back against the pillows and closed her eyes. Aunt Rachel sprang to her feet in alarm. I'm surprised at you for spreading William's rumors, William, she reproved him. They say no news is good news. Now 'tis way past Mercy's bedtime. She looks white as a ghost. She hesitated. Kit, you and William can hang out in the company room if you like. Kit did not look up from her spinning. 'Twould take a monstrous lot of wood to heat the room before midnight, she observed. William took the hint and pulled on his heavy beaver fur coat and cap. Kit would not have risen from her place at all, but Rachel, with a meaningful nudge, handed her a candle, and she had perforce to see her suitor to the door. In the hallway, William did not seem to dispose in a hurry. He lingered so long that Kit was forced to shut the door behind them to keep the chilling draught from the kitchen. I've missed you, Kit, said William finally. I had to come back. Kit said nothing. You don't seem very pleased to see me. How could a girl say that there had been a time when she had longed with all of her heart to see him? Besides, there was something more on William's mind. I don't want you to think that I hold anything against you, Kit, he said awkwardly. Everyone knows that you meant well. They are all saying in the town what a help you have been to your aunt these past weeks. You'll find when you come back, I promise you, Kit, that everyone is willing to let bygones be bygones and that you can make a fresh start. Kit looked down at the tip of William's great boot. What do you mean by a fresh start? She asked quietly. I mean that it is well over. The widow Tupper is gone, and it won't be necessary to see much of the Crufchild. Don't you agree, Kit, that from now on it would be wise to use a little more judgment about people? Mind you, I'm not speaking against charity, he went on, seeing her mouth open to protest. We're supposed to care for the poor, but you overdo it, Kit. But it wasn't charity, burst out Kit. Hannah and Prudence, they're my friends. That's just what I mean. We're judged by the company we keep, and in our position, people look to us for an example of what is right and proper. And I'm to set an example by turning my back on my friends? Kit's eyes glittered. Oh, Kit, pleaded William miserably, I didn't want to quarrel with you tonight. But try to see it from my side. It would make a man uneasy, never knowing what his wife would do next. 'Twould make a wife uneasy, never knowing whether she could depend on her husband, Kit answered levelly. William had the grace to flush, but he held stubbornly to his position. A month ago, Kit's temper would have flared, but all at once she realized that William could not really anger her. She had had a long time to think that night on the river bank, and the longer night in the constable's shed. She had never consciously made any decision, but suddenly there it was waiting and unmistakable. "'Tis no use, William," she said now. "You and I would always be uneasy, ale of our lives. We would always be hoping for the other one to be different, and always being disappointed when it didn't happen. No matter how hard I tried, I know I could never care about the things that seem so important to you." "The house isn't important to you?" he asked slowly. "Yes, in a way it is," she admitted. "I'd like to live in a fine house, but not if it means I have to be an example, not if it means I can't choose my own friends." William, too, had been doing some thinking. He did not seem surprised, only gravely regretful. "Perhaps you're right, Kit," he conceded. "I've hoped all this year that you would forget your odd ways and learn to fit in here. If I thought you would just try—" She shook her head. Then I won't be coming again? 'Tis no use, William, she repeated. At the door, he turned and looked back, his face baffled and unhappy. There was in his eyes just the merest flicker of the look she had seen there on that first morning outside the meeting house. In that instant, Kit knew that she had only to speak one word or to stretch out her hand, but she did not speak, and presently William opened the door and was gone. The long evenings about the hearth were seldom relieved by any visitor. For hours on end, with the whir of the spinning wheel and the twang of the loom were the only sounds. Except for a formal bow of greeting on Sabbath morning and on lecture day, Kit did not see William again till the day of Thankful Peabody's wedding. Thankful's wedding was the first festivity Weathersfield had enjoyed since the sickness. Through drifts of snow waist high, by sleigh and sled and snowshoe, young people and old folk and children gathered in the spacious Peabody house, relieved to shake off the labor and anxiety of the past week, and to rejoice with the happy couple. The feast spread out on the board would be talked about for weeks to come. There were apple and mince and dried berry pies, little spice cakes with maple sugar frosting, candied fruits and nuts, pitchers of sweet apple cider, and great mugs of steaming flip for the men. 7 different kinds of cake, Judith counted serendipitously. I'll never be able to have anything half so grand at my wedding. Kit scarcely heard her. She was remembering the last wedding she had attended. Could it had only been a year ago? In Barbados? She could shut her eyes and see the long damask covered table set with gold and silver plate. The banquet had lasted for 4 hours. Light from crystal chandelier had twinkled back from gold braid and jewelry and jewels. Deep windows had opened out on curving formal gardens, and the sea breezes had filled the room with the scent of flowers. An almost intolerable loneliness wrapped Kit around away from the joyous crowd. She was filled with a restlessness she could not understand. What was it that plagued her with this longing to turn back? Was it that far off memory of elegance and beauty? Or was it just the look in Thankful's eyes as she stood radiant in her rose-colored lute string wedding dress and listened to the toast to her future? Kit and Judith, each lost in their own thoughts, stood together near the wall, unable to join in the merrymaking. From across the room, William watched them gravely, making no move. When the bride and groom had driven off in their sleigh toward the snug new house that awaited them, the guests turned back to the laden tables. 2 fiddlers in the corner scraped a lively tune, and some of the more daring young people began to dance. No one paid attention to the 2 tardy guests who appeared at the door, letting in a gust of wind, till suddenly a woman screamed and threw her arms about a snow-covered figure. Then abruptly the music stopped and the laughter was checked, and everyone crowded about the newcomers. They were 2 Weathersfield men returned from Massachusetts with a detachment of militia. The story they had to tell put a somber end to the happy evening. Of the detachment of 20, only 8 had come back to Hartford. Just south of Hadley, before they could reach Deerfield, they had been ambushed by Indians who attacked savagely with bows and arrows and French rifles. 4 men had been killed outright, and 2 others had died of wounds on the trail home. The rest had been surrounded and taken captive. For a few days, the survivors had attempted to follow the Indians till a heavy snow had made it impossible to go on. They had found the scalped body of one of the captives lying by the trail, and they had little hope that in that whether of the prisoners would have been spared. They had turned back and made their way on snowshoes, barely reaching Hadley before another blizzard set in. The sombered guests crowded close, waiting for one answer. No, None of the Weathersfeld men had been killed, but one of the captives that was that young fellow who had been studying with the doctor, John Holbrook. And the mingled relief and horror, few of them noticed the faint wail that came from Judith, or saw her waver and fall. Kit and Rachel sprang forward, but it was William who reached her first and carried her gently to the settle by the fire, and it was William who later tucked her carefully into his sleigh and drove her home. In the weeks that followed, watching Judith, Kit began to understand how the gray shadow that was her Aunt Rachel could once have been the toast of an army. Hopelessness had erased the color and animation from Judith's face and set her lovely features into a still mask. Kit ached for her, but even more she was torn with pity for Mercy, whose grief could not find an outlet in a tear or word. Would Mercy's scant strength be equal to this burden? Rachel worried that her daughter did not gain and fussed over the fire, concocting nourishment stews which Mercy obediently tried to swallow. In some contradictory way, grief seemed to have etched on Mercy's thin face a beauty it had never possessed. Behind her clear gray eyes, the light burned steadily. Should I tell her? Kit wondered. Surely now Mercy has a right to know that John loved her. But watching Mercy's stillness, she found a new patience to resist her own impulse. Some day the time would come when Mercy could know. The Christmas season passed, unmarked by any rejoicing. There was no holiday in this Puritan town, no feasting, no gifts. The day went by like any other, filled with work, and Kit said nothing, ashamed that in this somber household she should even remember a happy English Yuletide. January dragged by, and February. It was the hardest winter most of the townspeople could remember. Old people shook their heads, recalling blizzards of their childhood, but it was impossible for Kit to visualize anything more bleak than this first winter of her experience. She no longer saw any beauty in a world muffled in white. She hated the long days of imprisonment when there was nothing to see through the window but shifting curtains of pale gray, when drifts stood waist high on the doorstep and it took hours of back-breaking labor to carve a passage to the well. She hated the drafty doors and frigid corners and the perpetual animal reek of heavy clothes hung about the fireplace to dry. Every night she shrank from the moment when she and Judith must make the dread ascent to the upstairs chamber with only the meager comfort of a warming pan. But impatient as she was with the long days indoors, the outdoors promised only aching misery. She resented the arduous preparation of the journey to meeting, the heavy leather boots, the knit socks drawn over them, the clumsy little foot stove they had to lug all the way that cooled off long before the sermon was finished and left one to sit with stinging fingers and toes, while the breath of the whole congregation rose like the smoke from so many pipes. How could Hannah ever have endured it? Kit often shivered. Alone in that cabin with the wind howling outside and no one to speak to for weeks on end but the cat and the goats? She hoped there was a cozy hearth at Nate's grandmother's house, and her own heart warmed at the thought of the two old ladies sharing it together. Then her restless thoughts would drift after the dolphin. Nate had offered to take her with him. Suppose she had accepted his offer, if she had never come back? Would anyone here in this house really have cared very much? By now, she would have been in Barbados. At this very moment, she might be. The broom in her hand or the treadle under her foot would idle to a top as she walked in imagination up the wide drive to her grandfather's house and stepped up to the long, shady veranda. Then she would shake herself free. Such daydreaming was a weakness. The house was sold, and she was here in New England, and perhaps Nate had never really meant his offer at all. One night she woke from a vivid dream. She and Nate had stood side by side at the bow of the Dolphin, watching that familiar curving prow carving gently through the calm turquoise water. They came soundlessly into a palm-studded harbor, fragrant with the scent of blossoms, and happiness was like sunshine, wrapping her round and pouring into her heart till it overflowed. She woke in the freezing darkness. I want to go back, she admitted at last, weeping. I want to go home, where green things are growing, and I will never see snow again as long as I live. Her tears scalding her eyelids froze instantly against the pillow. Lying tense beside Judith, she made a resolve. After that, all through the cheerless days, she hugged the dream close. Sometimes, driven by her restlessness, she would talk about Barbados to Mercy. Once, when I was quite small, she would say over the hum of the flax wheel, my grandfather took me to see a great cave. You had to go to it when the tide was very low, and when a wave dashed across the rocks and made a sort of curtain across the opening of the cave. But inside, it was very calm and still, and the water on the floor was as clear as glass. Underneath the water, there was a sort of garden made of colored rocks, and all over the roof of the cave there were queer hanging shapes, like those icicles outside the window, only pale green and orange and rose colored. It was so beautiful, Mercy. Mercy would look across at Kit's wistful face and smile in understanding. She knows, Kit thought. When I tell them that my mind is made up, she will not try to beat me. She will be sorry, I think, but truly, won't they, all of them, be a little relieved? In all honesty, she often argued, wouldn't she help the family most by leaving? Did the help she managed to give her aunt and uncle ever begin to make up for their trouble and for the inescapable fact that she was another person to feed and clothe? Though no one ever so much as hinted at it, the grim truth was that there were a short time ago 2 girls had been well provided for. There was now every likelihood of these 3 spinsters in the Wood household. No, she amended. Judith would never be a spinster. Kit had watched William's face in meeting, and she knew that he was only biding his time. And Judith, in spite of her downcast eyes, was well aware of this. By every right of beauty and accomplishment, Judith belonged in the new house on Broad Street. In their secret hearts, all 3 of them, she and William and Judith, had really known that all along. It needed only time now to bring about the match, which Kit and John Holbrook, which Kit and John Holbrook had interrupted. In March, a fresh blizzard buried the town in drifts. The long days wore on, one as like another as the endless threads of the loom. Through the bitter cold, though, did not abate. The daylight hours grew perceptibly longer. They lighted the candles a bit later every afternoon. Judith had just set the brass candlesticks on the table one late afternoon, and the girls were moving the table nearer to the hearth in preparation for supper, when a knock sounded at the door. See who it is, Kit, said Rachel absently. I don't want to take my hands out of this hour. Kit went into the hallway, leaving the kitchen door open behind her, drew back the bolt, and opened the door. A gaunt, ragged figure stood on the step. As she shrank back, a man pushed his way through the door and halted on the kitchen threshold. Judith suddenly let fall a wooden bowl with a clatter. Rachel, wiping her hands on her apron, came forward, peering in the dim light. Can it be John? She breathed tremulously. The man did not even hear her. His eyes had gone straight to Mercy, where she sat by the hearth, and her own eyes stared back, enormous in her white face. Then, with a hoarse, wordless sigh, John Holbrook stumbled across the room and went down on his knees with his head in Mercy's lap. Chapter 21. Last chapter. On a lecture day in April, 2 marriage intentions were announced together in the meeting house. John Holbrook and Mercy Wood, William Ashby, and Judith Wood. The Wood household was busy from dawn till dusk to midnight. There was so much to do if all were to be ready for the double wedding that was set for early May. There was the vital matter of the 2 dowries. Judith had been careful, hoarding a small store of linen since childhood, adding one cherished bit from time to time, and her loom and needle had worked busily. But Mercy had never given a thought to a dowry. She had not a single pillowcase or linen napkin that she could call her own. Now that Rachel fussed and stitched, Mercy still regarded the whole problem with indifference. Why did she need a dowry, she argued practically, when she was really not leaving home at all? She and John had already decided that for the first year, at least, they had best share the Woods' ample house. The company room was being readied with fresh whitewash and new linen curtains. John had resumed his studies with Dr. Bulkley. All his uncertainty had disappeared, and his steady eye and voice plainly revealed the core of strength that Kit had always sensed beneath his gentleness. In the days of his captivity, of which he never spoke, in the waiting for a chance to escape, and in the weary, hunted trail down the Connecticut River, John had found his answers. Dr. Bulkley is everything I ever thought him to be, a great scholar and a great gentleman, he explained. In politics, he is obeying his own conscience. But I think he is mistaken. We have come to an understanding. He will teach me theology and medicine, but I will think as I please. By June, he would be ready to accept a call to one of the small parishes springing up to the south and west of Wethersfield. William's house on Broad Street was nearly finished. Piece by piece, he was assembling the costly treasure for its furnishing, hand-turned bedsteads, and chests and chairs from the skilled Wethersfield joiner, Peter Blinn, glossy pewter plates, and a set of silver spoons from Boston, real china bowls of blue and white, left from Holland. Judith knew where every piece would go in the new house, and how to care for each lovely thing to keep it shining. She and William spent their evenings in happy planning, and their contentment was good to see. Kit had never found William so likable before. In the midst of this preparation, Kit silently made her own plans. She would not share them with anyone till every detail was carefully provided for. Her leaving would be a shock to them, she knew. Rachel and Matthew, in his own way, looked upon her as a daughter, but even a daughter, though welcomed and loved, could come to be a problem. There was no real place for her here. With John to help with the planting and Mercy still sharing the work of the household, there was no obligation now to hold Kit to the task she hated. They would protest, they might even sorrow a little, but in their hearts, wouldn't they be relieved to see her go? The ice on the river broke into a great floating blocks and gradually thinned and disappeared. The ferry boat began its daily journeys from Smith's Landing back and forth to the opposite shore. Small boats slipped out of their winter moorings, and one day a bustling, cheering crowd thronged along High Street to greet the first sailing ship up from New London. That afternoon, Kit climbed to the attic and surveyed the 7 small trunks. She had not looked inside them all winter. Now, one after the other, she threw back the lids and lifted my dresses, holding them up to see to the dim light. How long ago it had seemed that she had worn these things. Could it be not quite a year? The silks and muslins and gauzes still gleamed unworn and beautiful, and doubtless they were still fashionable. She touched them wistfully. It would be good to shed these shabby woolen garments and feel once more the softness of silk against her skin, and to hear the rustle of petticoats wherever she moved. But the dresses must serve another purpose now. Would they bring enough to pay her passage on a ship? Fine cloth like this was rare in Connecticut. In many families, she had learned, one dress such as these would be handed down through 3 generations as cherished possessions. Surely in Hartford, or perhaps even here in Weathersfield, she would find willing buyers, even though she had not yet worked out a plan for approaching them. As she lifted the peacock green dress, she hesitated. How radiant Judith had looked in this dress. If only William could see me in it, she had said. She laid aside the dress, and very thoughtfully she chose another fine blue flowered muslin. These two she would take directly to Uncle Matthew, and this time she felt sure that he would let his daughters accept them, because he would know now that she offered the gifts with love instead of pride. All Kit's plans now turned toward Barbados. She had no illusions about the prospect before her. She would not be going back as Sir Francis Tyler's granddaughter. She would go as a single woman who must work for her living. Her best chance, she had decided, lay in seeking employment as a governess in one of the wealthy families. She liked teaching children, and hopefully there might be a library where she could extend her own learning as well as that of her charges. Whatever befell, there would be a blue sky overhead and the warmth and color and fragrance and beauty that her heart craved. One day in mid-April, she walked alone down South Road. She could not go far, for the river was still very high from the melting snows. It had overflowed so that the fringe of the poplar trees on its banks stood deep in water, and the cornfields were transformed into endless lakes. Blackbird Pond had been swallowed up, and Hannah's house, had it still been standing there, would have been flooded up to its thatched roof. Poor Hannah! How had she endured this ordeal year after year, watching while the water crept nearer and nearer, stowing her valuables higher in the rafters, moving away goodness only knows to where, to wait out the season in some deserted barn or warehouse, and creeping back when the water receded to scrub out her house and replant her soggy garden. Kit was thankful, as she had been so many times when the wind howled and the snow piled higher, that her friend was snug in a proper house. But she knew a pang of homesickness none the less. The little cottage had been very dear to her. She perched on a sun-dried rock and sniffed the air. There was an earthy, indefinable scent that stirred her senses. The new shoots of the willows were a sharp yellow-green. The bare twigs of the maples were tipped by swelling red buds. A low bush nearby had blossomed in tiny gray balls. She had reached to touch one curiously. It was furry and soft as the kitten that Prudence had held in her arms that summer afternoon. All at once, Kit was aware that this New England, which had shown her the miracle of autumn and the white wonder of snow, had a new secret in store. This time it was a subtle surprise, a tantalizing hint of beauty still held within, a beckoning to her spirit to follow she knew not where. She had forgotten that summer would come again, that the green would spread over the frozen fields, that the earth would be turned up to the sun and the seeds sown, and that the meadows would renew themselves. Was this what strengthened these New Englanders to endure this winter? The knowledge that summer's return would all be the richer for waiting? Yet the spring air held a sadness too, sharper than all the loneliness of winters. The promise was not for her. I am going away, she thought, and for the first time the reminder brought no delight, only a deeper longing. She did not want to leave this place, after all. Suppose she should never walk in the meadows again. Suppose she Should never sit in the twilight with Mercy, or see Judith in the new house, or the girl Prudence would grow to be. Suppose she should never see Nate Eaton again. Suddenly she was trembling. She snatched at the dream that had comforted her for so long. It was faded and thin, like a letter too often read. She tried to remember how it had felt to stand on the deck of the Dolphin and see before her the harbor of Barbados. The haunting joy eluded her. The dream shores were dim and unreal. Why had she closed her heart to the true meaning of the dream? How long had she really known that the piercing happiness of that moment had come not from the sight of the harbor at all, but from the certainty that the one she loved stood beside her? If only I could go with Nate, she realized suddenly. It wouldn't matter where we went, to Barbados or just up and down the river, the Dolphin would be home enough. There is no escape if love is not there, Hannah had said. Had Hannah known when she herself had not even suspected? It was not escape that she had dreamed about. It was love. And love was Nate. It must have been Nate from the beginning, she admitted now, and with that knowledge came a sureness that she had never known in all of the last bewildering year. Memories of Nate came crowding back to her, agile and sure-footed, as she had first known him, leaning far out on the yardarm to grasp a billowing sail, throwing back his head in laughter, or shooting hot sparks of temper, sitting on a thatched roof in the sunshine, becoming miraculously out of the fog that morning, bending tenderly to lift a frightened old woman into the rowboat as she had seen him last, standing erect by the door of the magistrate's office, sending across the anger and confusion and steady reassurance and strength. Nate is New England too, she thought, like John Holbrook and Uncle Matthew. Why have I never seen that he is one of them? Under that offhand way of his, there is the same rock. Hannah has leaned on it for years, and I refuse to see it. Was it too late? He asked me to go, she reminded herself, but what did he mean? Only that he could never bear to see anyone in trouble, and that he came back. He risked the whipping post to come back and help me, but he took the same risk to rescue a yellow cat. After a long time, Kit started slowly home. The sun slanted slow in the sky, and behind her there began a sweet, disturbing melody. Peepers, Judith had said, the little frogs that lived in the swamp, and why should the sound of them tear at her heart? Too late? Too late? They queried over and over as she fled along the road to the house where she could shut herself away from them. From that moment in the meadow, Kit ceased to plan at all. She only waited. Somehow she found a way to meet every trading ship that came up the river. How beautiful these proud little sailing ships were. She never glimpsed their spreading sails without an answering surge of her spirits. Yet every new mast that rounded the bend of the river brought at the same time a fresh plunge of disappointment. Always she waited, her eyes straining to make out the figure on the prow, and always at the sight of those strange, glistening white figureheads, her heart sank. Why did the Dolphin not come? On the second day of May, as she came out on Wethersfield Landing, a trim little ketch was already tied up, fresh painted with clean white canvas, and not a barnacle on its hull. It must have been newly launched. The wharf was a confusion of unloading and bartering. A seaman in a blue coat bent to check a row of barrels, and as he straightened up, even before he turned or before she consciously recognized him, Kit began to run. Nate! The greeting burst from her. He turned and saw her, and then he was running too. As he caught her hand, she came to stop the wharf, the ship, and Nate himself swinging in a dizzy are before her eyes. Kit, it is Kit, isn't it? Not Mistress Ashby? Oh, no, Nate, no. I thought the old Dolphin would never make it. The blue gaze was too intense. She had to look away, and abruptly she was conscious of the crowded dock. She pulled her hands away and stepped back, trying, too late, to retrieve her dignity. "Uh, How is Hannah?" she stammered. "Chipper as a sandpiper. She and Gran have been fine company for each other." "And the dolphin? Did something happen to her?" "Just a heavy blow. She's hove down for repairs at the yard. What do you think of the new ketch?" "She's lovely." Then something in his tone made her look at him more sharply. The blue coat with brass buttons was brand new, and pride sparkled over Nate like the shiny paint on the new vessel. "Nate, you mean, you can't mean she's yours?" "All but a few payments. By the end of the good summer's trade, she'll be every inch mine from stem to stern." "I can't believe it. She's beautiful. Nate, even more beautiful than the dolphin." "Have you noticed her name?" Kit leaned sideways to see the letters painted jauntily on the transform. "The Witch. How dare you? Does Hannah know?" "Oh, she's not named after Hannah. I hadn't gone 10 miles down the river that day before I knew I'd left the real witch behind." She did not dare to look up at him. "Can I see her, Nate?" she asked instead. "Will you take me on board?" "No, not yet." His voice was full of decision. "I want to see your uncle first, Kit." His words came in an unpremeditated rush. "Will he think it is enough, the new ketch? There'll be a house some day in Saybrook or here in Weathersfield, if you like. I've thought of nothing else all winter. In November we'll sail south to the Indies. In the summer, Hannah and I will have a garden." "Kit," he glanced ruefully about the busy wharf. "Of all the places to choose, I didn't plan it like this. Aren't you going to invite me home with you?" Happiness brimmed over into shaky laughter. "Captain Eaton, we'd be proud to have you dine with us."